there is a particular kind of man that history tends to overlook. Not the legend, not the monster, not the name that gets carved into myth and ballad and the dark imagination of sailors huddled below deck on a moonless night. History remembers those men easily enough. History loves those men. It polishes their stories until they shine like gold doubloons, and it passes them down through the centuries with a reverence usually reserved for kings. No, the man history tends to overlook is the one who goes out and stops them. His name was Robert Maynard, and in the early hours of the 22nd of November, in the year 1718, on a shallow stretch of water off the coast of North Carolina known as Ocracoke Inlet, he did something that no man before him had managed to do. He faced the most feared pirate in the Atlantic world, a towering, black-bearded figure named Edward Teach, a man who had terrorized the American coastline and the Caribbean with an almost theatrical ferocity. And he did not flinch. He did not flee. He fought. And he won. But to understand what Robert Maynard did and why it matters, we have to begin not at the end, in the smoke and blood of that famous November morning, but much earlier. In the quieter world that made him, Maynard was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy of Great Britain, and that title, modest as it sounds to modern ears, carried with it a great weight of discipline, duty, and professionalism. He was not a privateer operating at the edges of the law. He was not a merchant captain sailing for profit. He was a servant of the Crown, trained in the culture of a navy that had been forged through decades of war against the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French. A navy that understood, better than most institutions of its age, what it meant to impose order upon a sea that had very little interest in it. We do not know precisely when Robert Maynard was born. History, in its characteristic carelessness with the men it does not consider romantic enough to memorialize, has not preserved that detail for us. What we do know is that by the second decade of the 18th century, he was an experienced officer, steady, capable, and possessed of exactly the kind of unflinching temperament that his superiors in the Royal Navy had come to rely upon. He served under Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, a man who had grown deeply, personally tired of watching pirates strangle the trade routes that fed the Virginia colony. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Spotswood was a man of action, and in Maynard he found a man of equal resolve. The vessels Maynard commanded for his mission against Blackbeard were, in themselves, a kind of quiet poetry in contrast. He was given two small sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, neither of which carried mounted cannon capable of standing broadside against a serious warship. They were shallow-drafted vessels, chosen specifically because they could navigate the treacherous sandbars and tidal inlets of the Carolina coast where Blackbeard had made his refuge. Maynard's fleet was lean. It was modest. Against the Adventure, the pirates' well-armed sloop, it was, by any conventional measure, outgunned. And yet, what makes Robert Maynard genuinely fascinating, what makes him worth sitting with, worth understanding, is precisely that absence of mythology around him. He did not dress for the occasion. He did not cultivate a legend. He simply prepared, and he persevered. And when the moment came, he held the line in a way that changed the entire tenor of the golden age of piracy. Because Blackbeard was not merely a man. By 1718, Blackbeard had become a symbol, proof, in the minds of many, that the pirates of the Atlantic were simply beyond the reach of lawful authority, proof that the sea belonged to whoever was willing to be ruthless enough to take it. Maynard disagreed, and in the months and years that followed that November morning, after the smoke cleared and the tide carried away what it would carry away, the golden age of piracy began, quietly, inexorably, to end. Not because of one battle alone, of course, but because of what that battle said. because of the message it sent, in the clearest possible language, to every man sailing under a black flag from the Bahamas to the Carolinas, that the Crown's long arm had finally found its reach. Robert Maynard never became a household name. He never got the ballads or the broadsheets or the breathless retellings, but the world he helped make possible, a world in which the Atlantic trade routes could breathe again, in which merchant vessels could sail without that particular cold dread settling into the chest of every captain at nightfall. That world owes him more than it has ever properly acknowledged. This is the story of the man who ended Blackbeard. This is the story of Robert Maynard. To understand why Robert Maynard's mission existed at all, you have to understand the world he was sailing into. The early 18th century was, by almost any measure, an extraordinary time to be alive on the Atlantic. Trade was expanding at a pace that would have been difficult to imagine even 50 years prior. Ships moved constantly between the colonies of the New World and the ports of Europe, carrying tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Barbados, indigo from the Carolinas, and silver from the mines of Spanish America. The Atlantic had become, in the span of a few generations, the most economically consequential body of water on Earth. And wherever great wealth moves in concentrated, predictable patterns, certain men will always appear to take it. The pirates of the early 18th century did not emerge from nowhere. They were, in a very real sense, a product of the wars that had come before them. For nearly a quarter century, Europe had been convulsed by conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession, which ground on from 1701 until its exhausted conclusion in 1713, had employed thousands of sailors and privateers, men who were given legal license by their respective governments to raid enemy shipping, to board foreign vessels, to take what could be taken in the name of the Crown. These men were skilled. They were experienced. They were, in the language of the sea, hard. And then, quite suddenly, the war ended, and the treaties were signed, and the governments of Europe looked at these thousands of capable, violent, seaborne men and offered them something that must have felt like a profound insult. They offered them nothing, no pensions, no land, no meaningful transition back into the civilian world that had moved on without them. The Royal Navy demobilized with the casual indifference of an institution that had gotten what it needed and no longer required the instrument it had used to get it. And so these men, these sailors and gunners and navigators, trained by years of war to take what they wanted from the sea, made a decision that was, in its own grim way, entirely logical. They kept doing what they knew how to do. Only now, they did it for themselves. This period, roughly from 1715 to 1726, is what historians have come to call the golden age of piracy. And golden it was, at least for those doing the plundering. The Bahamas became a kind of open republic of pirates, centered on the island of New Providence, where a man named Charles Vane and others of his temperament had essentially established a shadow government of lawlessness. Ships came and went without interference. Stolen goods were sold openly. The rule of law, in that corner of the Atlantic, had simply ceased to apply. It was into this world that Edward Teach, Blackbeard, rose to prominence. Blackbeard is one of those historical figures who is simultaneously overexposed and genuinely extraordinary. The stories told about him are so vivid, so operatic, that it can be tempting to dismiss them as embellishment. But the historical record, such as it is, suggests that the reality of the man was not far behind the legend. He was, by all accounts, physically imposing, in a way that made an immediate impression. Tall, broad-shouldered, with that famous beard grown long and tied with ribbons or slow-burning cord during battle, so that smoke would curl around his face like something risen from a fever dream. He understood, with an almost modern instinct, the power of image. He knew that terror, properly managed, was more efficient than violence. A merchant captain who believed he was facing a demon was a merchant captain who would surrender his cargo without a fight, and that suited Blackbeard perfectly well. But Blackbeard was not merely theatrical. He was operationally gifted. He commanded ships with skill. He managed crews, fractious, ungovernable, perpetually dissatisfied crews, with a combination of charisma, cunning, and calculated unpredictability that kept men loyal to him in a world where loyalty was the scarcest commodity afloat. At his height, he commanded a fleet of vessels and hundreds of men, and he moved through the Atlantic and Caribbean with a freedom that was, to the colonial authorities watching from shore, nothing short of infuriating. His flagship, during the height of his power, was the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship that he had captured and converted into a formidable warship carrying somewhere in the range of 40 guns. With that vessel beneath him, Blackbeard had blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1718. He had held an entire colonial city to ransom. He had demanded medicine and supplies and received them, and then he had sailed away, unhurried, into the open sea, while the people of Charleston stood on their docks and watched and understood with a sinking clarity that the normal structures of law and order simply did not reach this far. The Queen Anne's Revenge would eventually run aground, deliberately, many historians believe, as part of Blackbeard's own complicated schemes, and Blackbeard would settle into a quieter arrangement, accepting a royal pardon in North Carolina and living for a time in a kind of semi-legitimate domesticity in the colony. He allegedly married there. He had a home. He had, or appeared to have, stepped back from the life. But old habits have a gravity of their own. By the autumn of 1718, Blackbeard was operating again out of Ocracoke Inlet on the Carolina coast, raiding, entertaining fellow pirates, and living under the protection of the notoriously corrupt North Carolina governor Charles Eden, who appears to have been perfectly happy to live the other way in exchange for a share of whatever Blackbeard brought ashore. It was a comfortable arrangement for everyone involved. Everyone, that is, except the merchants whose ships were being stripped, and the planters and traders of Virginia who watched their commerce suffer, and their letters to the authorities go unanswered. One man, more than any other, had decided that he had heard quite enough. Alexander Spotswood, the royal governor of Virginia, was not a man who accepted helplessness easily. He was an administrator of considerable energy and ambition, a former British Army officer who had brought to the governance of Virginia the kind of direct martial temperament that tends to find bureaucratic inertia intensely irritating. He had watched Blackbeard operate. He had watched the Carolina authorities do nothing. He had watched the Atlantic trade that fed his colony bleed, steadily and persistently, into pirate hands. And he had come to a conclusion that was simple and unambiguous. If the law would not go to Blackbeard, Spotswood would send the law himself. There was a jurisdictional problem, of course. Ocracoke Inlet was in North Carolina, not Virginia. Spotswood did not technically have authority to conduct military operations there. He was aware of this. He proceeded anyway, financing the expedition partly from his own resources, and organizing it with the kind of quiet, deliberate thoroughness that suggests he understood exactly what he was risking and had decided the risk was worth it. He arranged for 2 sloops to be fitted out. He arranged for naval crews to man them, and he chose to lead the expedition a Royal Navy lieutenant who happened to be in the area with his vessel. He chose Robert Maynard. It is worth pausing here, in the stillness before the storm, to consider what Maynard was being asked to do. He was being sent, with 2 small, lightly armed vessels and a complement of sailors, rather than trained marines, into shallow coastal waters he did not know well, to find and engage a pirate whose reputation was terrifying and whose crew was experienced and well armed. He was being sent with no element of surprise. The Carolina coast was porous with informants and gossip, and there was every reason to believe that Blackbeard might know he was coming. He was being sent with, as his primary advantage, Nothing more than discipline, preparation, and the particular quality of character that allows a man to move steadily forward when every instinct of self-preservation is suggesting he finds somewhere else to be. He accepted. There is no record of a dramatic speech, no account of Maynard rallying his men with stirring words before they cast off from the Virginia coast in mid-November of 1718. What the records do show is that he sailed south along the coastline with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided on a course and had no intention of being deflected from it. He carried sealed orders. He carried the authority of Governor Spotswood. He carried, on those two modest sloops, a crew of men who had signed on knowing, at least in broad terms, what they were sailing into. The water along that coast in November is cold and grey and shallow and endlessly complicated. A landscape of sandbars and tidal channels and wind-bent marsh grass stretching in every direction without obvious landmark. It is the kind of place that rewards local knowledge and punishes overconfidence. Blackbeard knew it intimately. Maynard was learning it as he went, and somewhere ahead, anchored in the relative shelter of Ocracoke Inlet, a bearded man sat aboard his sloop with his crew, drinking the evening away with the comfortable certainty of a man who had, so far, never encountered anything the sea had sent against him that he could not defeat. He did not yet know that this had changed. The sloops moved south. There is something worth dwelling on in that simple fact. The unhurried, methodical southward progress of two small vessels along the Virginia and Carolina coastline in the grey middle of November 1718. No cannons fired in announcement, no flags raised in challenge, just two wooden hulls cutting quietly through cold Atlantic water, carrying men who knew what waited for them at the end of the journey and had chosen to make it anyway. Maynard's vessels, the Jane and the Ranger, were not warships in any grand sense of the word. They were working sloops, the kind of practical, shallow-drafted craft that populated every harbor and inlet along the American colonial coast. The Jane was the larger of the two, and Maynard commanded her directly. The Ranger sailed alongside, under the command of a man named Mr. Hyde, another officer, steady and capable, who would play his own role in what was coming. Together, they carried somewhere in the region of 60 men, not soldiers, sailors, men trained to manage rigging and read wind and navigate coastal shallows, men who could fight when fighting was required, but who were not, by any stretch, the hardened Marines that a mission of this kind might ideally have called for. Spotswood had done what he could. The rest was Maynard's. The coastline they traveled along was, and remains today, one of the more geographically peculiar stretches of the American eastern seaboard. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are a chain of long, thin barrier islands, narrow ribbons of sand and scrub grass separating the open Atlantic from the sounds and inlets behind them. Pamlico Sound, Albemarle Sound, Ocracoke Inlet. These were not deep-water channels where a large naval vessel could operate with confidence. They were shallow, shifting, treacherous places where the bottom rose and fell with the tides, and where a keel set down in the wrong place could ground a vessel so firmly that no amount of effort would move it before the tide changed. They were, in short, the perfect hiding place for a man who knew them well and wanted to be left alone. Blackbeard knew them perfectly. He had been anchored at Ocracoke for some weeks by the time Maynard's sloops appeared on the horizon. The inlet had become something of a gathering point for pirates in that season. There are accounts of a kind of loose, informal gathering, other captains and their crews coming and going, drinking and trading and sharing whatever intelligence was passing through that corner of the Atlantic. Blackbeard himself is described, in the days before the battle, as being in tolerably good spirits. He had his sloop, the Adventure, well positioned. He had his crew around him. He had, in the geography of Ocracoke, a natural fortress, shallow water that would stop any serious naval vessel long before it got close enough to threaten him, and multiple channels of escape if anything unexpected materialized. What he did not have was adequate warning. The question of how much intelligence Blackbeard possessed about Maynard's approach has occupied historians for a long time, and the honest answer is that it remains genuinely uncertain. There are suggestions that he received some report. That word came to him through the loose network of informants and sympathizers that lined the Carolina coast, that vessels had been dispatched from Virginia to find him. The accounts of that evening, the night before the battle, lean into this ambiguity in ways that are either poignant or damning, depending on how generously you read them. What we know is this. On the evening of the 21st of November, 1718, a vessel passing near Ocracoke hailed the Adventure, and someone aboard, possibly Blackbeard himself, was asked whether he knew that men were coming for him. The reply, according to the account preserved by the journalist and chronicler Charles Johnson, whose general history of the Pirates remains our richest single source for this period, was characteristically theatrical. Blackbeard reportedly answered that he cared for no quarter and would give none. It is a line that has the unmistakable ring of performance to it. The kind of thing a man says when he is aware that people are listening and wants the listening to mean something. But beneath the bravado, there is also something that reads, in retrospect, like a man who had spent so long being the most dangerous thing in any given stretch of water, that he had genuinely stopped being able to imagine otherwise. He had survived so much. He had faced down so many. The calculus of his experience told him that the men coming for him were simply another entry in a long list of threats that had, each in its turn, proved insufficient. That evening, his crew drank. The account suggests they drank considerably. Maynard, by contrast, was working. The exact position of the Jane and Ranger on the night of November 21st is a matter of some historical reconstruction, but the most credible accounts suggest they anchored at a careful distance from the inlet, close enough to move at first light, far enough to avoid announcing their presence before they were ready to commit. Maynard would have known that the element of surprise, whatever remained of it, was among his most valuable assets. He would have known that Blackbeard's crew, if given time and daylight to organize themselves, would be a significantly more dangerous proposition than a crew caught still groggy from the previous night. He planned to move at dawn. What passed through Maynard's mind in those dark November hours, anchored off the Carolina coast with the wind off the Atlantic and the sound of water against the hull? That, history cannot tell us. He left no diary. No letters from that period survive that illuminate his inner state. What we have is the shape of his choices, and the choices speak of a man who had made his peace with the morning and was occupying himself with practical matters. He would have reviewed the charts, such as they were, of Ocracoke Inlet. He would have spoken with his officers. He would have ensured that his men understood the plan, and the plan, stripped to its essentials, was brutally straightforward. Get into the inlet, find the Adventure, engage her, win. The simplicity of it belied the extraordinary difficulty of each individual step. Getting into Ocracoke Inlet with any kind of speed required navigating sandbars in low light with imperfect charts. Finding the Adventure in an inlet with multiple channels and limited visibility required either luck or good intelligence, or both. Engaging a vessel that outgunned him with a crew that outnumbered him in fighting experience required something that maps and plans and careful preparation could only partially provide. It required, in the end, the willingness to absorb punishment and keep moving forward. There is a detail from the pre-battle maneuvering on the morning of November 22nd that deserves particular attention, because it illustrates something essential about both men and about what kind of contest this was actually going to be. As Maynard's sloops made their approach into the inlet in the early morning light, they grounded. The sandbars of Ocracoke were exactly as treacherous as advertised, and one or both of Maynard's vessels found the bottom before they had closed the distance to the Adventure. This was, by any operational measure, a serious problem. A grounded vessel is a stationary target against a crew with cannon, is a vessel that can be reduced to splinters at leisure. Maynard responded to this crisis the way competent officers throughout history have responded to crises. He adapted immediately. He had his men move weight in the hull, jettison ballast, do whatever was required to get the sloop free. And he did it quickly enough that the delay, while dangerous, did not prove fatal. Blackbeard, watching from the Adventure, had his own tactical response to the approach of Maynard's vessels. He opened fire. The first exchange of the battle was an artillery duel, and in that duel, Blackbeard held every advantage. The Adventure carried guns that the Jane and Ranger simply could not match, and the opening broadside from the pirate sloop was devastating. The Ranger, Mr. Hyde's vessel, was struck with particular ferocity. Hyde himself was killed or mortally wounded in that first exchange, along with a significant portion of his crew. The Ranger, suddenly leaderless and badly damaged, was functionally knocked out of the fight before the morning had properly begun. Maynard, aboard the Jane, watched this happen. He kept moving forward. It is in this moment, this specific documented moment of the battle at Ocracoke Inlet, that Robert Maynard reveals himself most clearly as the man this documentary is about. He had just watched his supporting vessel destroyed as an effective fighting force. He was in shallow, unfamiliar water. He was facing a crew that was larger and more experienced in close combat than his own. The rational calculation, the one that would have been entirely defensible to any board of inquiry afterward, would have been to disengage, to pull back, to report that the odds were impossible and that a fresh approach was required. He did not disengage. He did something far more interesting. He looked at the deck of the Jane, at his crew, exposed, vulnerable, taking fire from the Adventure's cannon, and he made a decision that would determine the entire outcome of the battle. He ordered his men below decks, not in retreat, not in panic, but in preparation. He would leave the deck of the Jane appearing largely empty, stripped of visible resistance, and when Blackbeard and his men, seeing an apparently broken, near-empty vessel, came surging over the rails to finish the job, in the way pirates had always finished the job, they would find something very different waiting for them in the smoke. They would find Robert Maynard, and they would find every man he had left. Dawn over Ocracoke Inlet on the 22nd of November, 1718, would have been a quiet thing, the kind of quiet that sits on coastal water in late autumn, grey and still, and carrying in it the particular coldness of a season turning hard. The marsh grass along the banks would have been pale and frost-edged. The sound of the water would have been low, almost conversational. Gulls, perhaps, the creak of rigging, the soft percussion of a hull moving against its anchor. And then the light came up, and the two worlds that had been moving toward each other for weeks, the world of Robert Maynard and the world of Edward Teach, finally saw each other clearly across the shallow water of the inlet, and everything that had been building toward this morning arrived at once. Maynard's sloops had moved with the earliest light, pressing into the inlet as carefully as the channels allowed. Blackbeard's crew, aboard the Adventure, had seen them coming. The accounts suggest there was a brief, almost formal exchange at a distance, voices carrying across the water, Maynard identifying himself as a naval officer, Blackbeard responding with the particular contempt of a man who had made a career of not recognizing the authority of naval officers. There are slightly varying versions of the exchange in the historical sources, but the spirit of it is consistent across all of them. Blackbeard was not interested in surrender. Maynard was not offering it. What followed was the opening artillery exchange described at the close of our last passage, and it was brutal in the way that only the first minutes of a naval engagement can be brutal, sudden, overwhelming, and decided at a speed that leaves no time for the mind to process what the body is experiencing. The Adventure's guns spoke first, and spoke loudly, and the Ranger absorbed the worst of it. Mr. Hyde went down. His crew, reduced and disorganized, could no longer function as an effective fighting unit. One of Maynard's two vessels had been neutralized before the sun had properly cleared the horizon, but Maynard's plan was already in motion. The decision to send his men below decks was not impulsive. It was the product of a mind that had looked honestly at the tactical situation and identified the one scenario in which his disadvantages became irrelevant. He could not win an artillery duel. He did not have the guns for it. He could not win a straightforward boarding action against Blackbeard's crew, men who had spent their careers in exactly this kind of close, brutal, personal violence, who knew how to move on a deck slick with seawater and blood, who fought with the particular ferocity of people who understood that losing meant hanging. What Maynard could do, what he had that Blackbeard did not, was discipline, planning, the ability to make his men hold a position and wait and trust the officer who had put them there. He sent them below. He kept a skeleton crew visible, just enough men to manage the Jane's rigging and maintain forward movement. And he waited. Blackbeard saw what he expected to see. From the deck of the Adventure, the picture would have been almost satisfying. The Ranger was out of the fight. The Jane was moving toward him with a deck that appeared largely empty. Evidence, as far as Blackbeard was concerned, that his opening broadside had done its work. The vessel coming at him appeared battered and undermanned, crewed by a handful of survivors still on their feet, more from momentum than from any meaningful capacity to resist. It was, in the language of the sea in 1718, a broken prize waiting to be taken. He brought the Adventure alongside. The accounts of what happened next have been told many times, and they lose nothing in the retelling, because the reality of those minutes was so compressed and so violent and so consequential that no amount of familiarity fully softens them. Blackbeard's men came over the rails of the Jane in numbers, boarding with the aggressive confidence of a crew that believed the hard work had already been done by the cannon. They came with pistols and cutlasses and the edged weapons that close quarters fighting on a wooden deck in the early 18th century demanded. They came expecting to find a broken crew, a few wounded men, a vessel ready to be claimed. What they found instead was Robert Maynard rising up from below with every man he had. The fighting that followed was, by the accounts of all who survived it, extraordinarily savage. This was not the distant, almost abstract violence of cannon fire. This was two groups of men in a space roughly the size of a large room, with no room to retreat and no quarter being asked or offered, working through each other with every implement available. The deck of the Jane became, in the space of minutes, one of the most violently contested pieces of wood in the Atlantic world. Blackbeard himself fought in a manner that has become one of the most documented and most remarkable individual performances in the history of maritime combat. He did not hang back. He did not direct from a safe distance. He waded into the fighting personally, and what the historical accounts describe is a man who absorbed damage that should have stopped him and kept moving forward with a ferocity that seemed to belong to something other than ordinary human endurance. He was shot. The accounts vary, but the number most consistently cited is 5 times. He received multiple cutlass wounds. His body, by the end, bore something in the range of 20 separate injuries, and there is in that number a quality that strains credibility until you consider the physiology of extreme combat, the way that adrenaline and fury and the absolute refusal of a particular kind of mind to acknowledge its own limitation can carry a body past points that reason insists should be terminal. He kept fighting. There is a moment in the battle, one of those instants that history has preserved with unusual clarity precisely because of how improbable it sounds, where Blackbeard and Maynard faced each other directly. The two men who had been moving toward this encounter for weeks, who represented in their persons two entirely different philosophies about what the sea was for, and who had the right to take from it, stood on the same deck and fought. Maynard fired his pistol at Blackbeard. Blackbeard was hit. Blackbeard raised his own weapon in return. By some accounts, the weapon misfired or was spent. By other accounts, The narrative simply moves forward in the way that combat narratives move forward, not pausing for drama but lurching through it, event to event, without the courtesy of clear sequence. What is clear is that Maynard survived the encounter and Blackbeard did not. The killing blow, if a single blow can be said to have ended a man who had absorbed so much before it, came from one of Maynard's sailors, a Scottish seaman whose name is sometimes recorded as simply a Highlander in the older accounts, and who has been more specifically identified in some sources as a man in Maynard's crew who got behind Blackbeard at the crucial moment and delivered a cutlass wound to the neck of sufficient severity that even that extraordinary constitution could not continue past it. Blackbeard fell. The accounts say that even falling, he attempted to raise his weapon one final time, that the hand moved toward the pistol, that something in the machinery of the man, that furious, ungovernable engine that had driven him across a decade of violence and thousands of miles of Atlantic, was still running, even as everything else gave out, and then it stopped. The effect on the fighting was immediate. There is a dynamic in close-quarters combat that has been observed across centuries and cultures. The moment when the dominant figure falls, when the organizing force of a group's courage collapses with him, and the fight goes out of men who were formidable 30 seconds earlier. It happened on the deck of the Jane that November morning. Blackbeard's crew, seeing their captain down, lost the coherence that had made them dangerous. Some fought on from momentum or desperation. Some jumped overboard into the cold, shallow water of the inlet and were dealt with there. Others surrendered. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet was over. Maynard, following the custom of naval engagements in that era, and perhaps following something more personal, some need to make the reality of the morning absolutely undeniable to every authority who would subsequently need to be convinced of what had happened here, ordered Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of the Jane. It is not a detail that sits comfortably with modern sensibility, and it is not meant to. It was a brutal age, and this had been a brutal morning, and the display served a practical purpose beyond the merely gruesome. When Maynard sailed back north toward Virginia with that grim figurehead on his bow, there would be no ambiguity about the outcome. No room for rumor or doubt, or the kind of persistent legend that gathers around figures whose deaths are not made absolutely visible. Blackbeard was dead. Robert Maynard was bringing the proof. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew were taken aboard as prisoners, to be transported to Virginia for trial. The adventure was dealt with. Accounts suggest she was burned, though the exact fate of the vessel varies slightly across sources. The Ranger, damaged and diminished, made what repairs she could. The Jane turned her prow northward. The inlet returned to quiet. The marsh grass along the banks did not record what had happened. The shallow water of Ocracoke closed over the morning without ceremony. The gulls that had scattered at the sound of the cannon returned, in the way that birds always return, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly interrupted the ordinary business of the coast. But the world that those two sloops sailed back into was not quite the same world they had left. Something had shifted. Something fundamental and load-bearing in the architecture of the golden age of piracy had given way, and the men who lived by that age, the men who sailed under black flags and trusted in the reputation of their kind to keep the sea open to them, would spend the months and years ahead discovering just how much that shift mattered. The legend was dead. The consequences were only beginning. The Jane moved north along the Carolina and Virginia coastline with the particular heaviness of a vessel that has been through something, not the heaviness of damage alone. Though there was damage enough, her hull marked and her crew thinned by the violence of the morning. It was the heavier quality that settles into a ship after a thing has been decided aboard her, after the noise has stopped, and the men still standing have had a moment to look around at the men who are not, and the full arithmetic of the morning has been counted and cannot be uncounted. Maynard had lost a significant portion of his crew. The Ranger had been gutted as a fighting force before the boarding even began. Of the roughly 60 men who had sailed south from Virginia days earlier, a sobering number would not be returning. Victory, in the 18th century, as in any century, had a cost that the word itself did not always acknowledge. Maynard bore that cost with the same steadiness he had brought to everything else. The prisoners were secured. The wounded were attended to as best the resources of 2 small sloops would allow. The grim trophy at the bowsprit of the Jane swayed with the motion of the vessel, announcing across the water to any ship they passed what kind of morning it had been and what kind of man had commanded it. Word travels fast on coastlines. Long before Maynard's sloops reached the Virginia shore, the news was already moving, carried by fishing vessels and coastal traders who had seen the Jane pass, who had seen what hung from her bow, who understood immediately the significance of what they were looking at. It moved through the communities along the Outer Banks and up through the tidewater settlements of Virginia with the particular velocity of information that people had been waiting for without quite knowing it. Something had happened at Ocracoke. The pirate was dead. The Navy lieutenant had done it by the time Maynard arrived in the Virginia waters and brought his vessels into port. Alexander Spotswood was ready to receive him. The governor's response to Maynard's return was everything that the mission itself had been: efficient, purposeful, and oriented entirely toward the practical consequences of what had been accomplished. Spotswood was not a sentimental man. He understood that the death of Blackbeard was not, in itself, the conclusion of anything. It was a beginning. It was a statement, made in the clearest available language, that the colonial authorities were capable of reaching into the Carolina inlets and extracting precisely the outcome they required. The value of that statement depended almost entirely on what happened next, on whether the legal machinery could process the moment into something durable. The prisoners from Blackbeard's crew were the immediate priority. There were 14 of them, survivors of the Adventure's crew who had been taken aboard the Jane after the fighting ended. They were transported to Williamsburg, the colonial capital of Virginia, and there they were held to await trial. Spotswood moved with considerable speed to convene that trial, and the proceedings that followed in March of 1790 were, by the standards of colonial jurisprudence, swift and unambiguous. The trial of Blackbeard's crew was conducted under the Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, legislation passed by the British Parliament in 1700 that had been specifically designed to make the prosecution of pirates simpler and faster, by allowing trials to proceed in colonial vice-admiralty courts rather than requiring transportation of prisoners back to England. Spotswood had been a proponent of using this legislation aggressively, and the Williamsburg trial was in many ways a demonstration of exactly how it was meant to function. There was no prolonged legal maneuvering. There was no extended period of uncertainty. The evidence was presented, the charges were considered, and the outcomes were delivered with the decisiveness of an institution that understood it was making a point as much as it was administering justice. 13 of the 14 prisoners were convicted. Of those 13, all were sentenced to death. 12 were hanged. One, a man named Samuel Odell, who appears in the records as having been aboard the Adventure only by the misfortune of having been there the previous evening and not having departed before Maynard arrived, was able to demonstrate sufficiently that he was not a member of Blackbeard's permanent crew, and his sentence was commuted. The other 12 were executed at Williamsburg, their bodies displayed in the manner that the law prescribed for pirates, hung in chains at prominent locations along the waterfront, where the sight of them would instruct anyone arriving by sea in the consequences of the life they represented. It was theater, in the way that all public execution is theater. But it was effective theater. It communicated to the maritime community of the colonial Atlantic something that words in a proclamation or a governor's letter could never quite convey with the same immediacy. The machinery was working. The law had teeth. The news, meanwhile, was crossing the Atlantic. In London, The death of Blackbeard was received with considerable satisfaction in the circles that cared about such things, which is to say, in the merchant houses and insurance offices and trading company boardrooms, where the practical cost of Atlantic piracy had been felt most consistently and most financially. The Lloyd's Coffee House, around which so much of the maritime insurance business of the era revolved, would have processed the news with the particular relief of men who had spent years watching their premiums climb in response to a threat that now, suddenly, appeared to be receding. Ships insured for the Atlantic crossing carried a risk premium that reflected the reality of operating in waters where Blackbeard and his kind had operated freely. That reality was changing. The broader strategic context matters here, because it shapes what Maynard's victory at Ocracoke actually meant in the larger arc of the golden age of piracy. Blackbeard was not the last pirate. He was not even, by some measures, the most destructive. Bartholomew Roberts, Blackbeard, as he would come to be known, was already operating in Atlantic waters, and would go on to capture more vessels than Blackbeard ever did before his own death in 1722. The problem of piracy was not solved at Ocracoke Inlet on the 22nd of November, 1718. But something was solved there, or rather, something was demonstrated there that had not been convincingly demonstrated before. The pirates of the Golden Age had operated with a foundational confidence, partly justified, partly psychological, that the colonial authorities simply could not reach them, that the geography of the Atlantic, with its thousands of miles of coastline and its countless inlets and cays and shallow anchorages, provided a protection that no naval force would trouble itself to overcome. Blackbeard at Ocracoke was the purest expression of this confidence. He was anchored in shallow water that serious naval vessels could not navigate, in a colony whose governor was effectively his collaborator, with a crew around him and a reputation ahead of him that had to that point proven sufficient to manage every threat. Maynard had reached him anyway, with 2 sloops, with 60 men, with imperfect charts and no element of surprise, and a supporting vessel knocked out of the fight in the opening minutes. He had reached Blackbeard in his sanctuary, in his geography, in his confidence, and he had killed him. And the message that sent, not just to the pirates of the Atlantic, but to the governors and merchants and naval administrators trying to decide whether the suppression of piracy was worth the effort and expenditure, was incalculable in its value. It was worth it. Spotswood understood this, and he was not shy about making the case. His correspondence in the months following Ocracoke is that of a man who knows he has accomplished something significant and intends to ensure that the significance is properly registered in London. He wrote to the Board of Trade. He wrote to the Admiralty. He made the case, carefully and with supporting detail, that the investment in Maynard's expedition had paid dividends that extended far beyond the removal of a single pirate from the Atlantic. He had demonstrated a method. He had shown what colonial authorities, properly resourced and properly resolved, could achieve against a threat that many had been treating as effectively permanent. Whether Maynard himself was entirely comfortable with the level of credit that Spotswood claimed for the operation is a question the historical record does not clearly answer. What we know is that the relationship between the 2 men in the aftermath of Ocracoke was cordial, but not uncomplicated. Spotswood had financed the expedition, organized it, and made the political decisions that allowed it to happen. Maynard had sailed it, fought it, and brought it home. The relative weight of those contributions was not always resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and there are hints in the correspondence of the period of the kind of institutional friction that tends to develop when a successful operation produces more credit than any single party can comfortably contain. Maynard received recognition. He received the approval of the Navy and the acknowledgement of the colonial authorities. He did not receive the kind of immediate transformative reward that a man of a different temperament might have expected or demanded from so singular an achievement. The prize money from the expedition. There were provisions for distributing the value of captured pirate vessels and goods among the crews that took them, was the subject of some subsequent dispute, and the process of actually collecting what was owed took longer than anyone who had bled for it might have thought reasonable. But Robert Maynard had not sailed to Ocracoke for prize money. He had sailed because he was ordered to sail, and because he was the kind of man who, having been given an order of that gravity and that danger, was constitutionally unable to execute it with anything less than his full ability and his full nerve. He was a professional. In an age that celebrated the theatrical and the larger-than-life, he was something quieter and, in its way, more enduring. He was the kind of man who wins, and the world that was beginning to take shape in the wake of his victory. The world in which pirate sanctuaries were no longer truly sanctuaries, in which black flags no longer conferred the protection they once had, in which the Atlantic was, however slowly and imperfectly, being brought back within the reach of law. That world was carrying his fingerprints on it, whether it knew his name or not. History has a preference for fire. It gravitates, almost instinctively, toward the men and moments that burn brightest, the ones that produce the most dramatic image, the most quotable line, the most vivid scene. It is drawn to Blackbeard standing on the deck of the Adventure with slow match cords smoking in his beard and pistols crossed over his chest, because that image does something to the imagination that a competent naval lieutenant making careful preparations in a Virginia harbor simply does not do. History is, in this sense, a curator with very particular taste. It selects for spectacle. It files away the rest. And so the years after Ocracoke Inlet unfolded in the way that the years after most significant historical moments unfold, not with the clean resolution of a story that knows it is ending, but with the complicated, undramatic continuation of lives that had not finished simply because a decisive thing had happened in them. The world moved on. New problems arose to replace the ones that had been solved. The men involved in the events of November 1718 grew older, or died, or were simply absorbed back into the ordinary machinery of their time. Robert Maynard continued to serve. There is something fitting and something slightly melancholy in that sentence, depending on how you hold it. He returned to active duty in the Royal Navy following his return from Ocracoke, and he served with the same professionalism and the same quiet competence that had defined his career before the battle made his name briefly prominent in the correspondence of governors and admiralty officials. He was promoted, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant commander, a recognition of his service that was real and meaningful within the institutional culture of the Navy, even if it fell short of the more dramatic advancement that the size of his achievement might have seemed to warrant. He served in various capacities in the years following 1718, operating in the Atlantic and Caribbean in the ongoing business of a navy that always had more work than it had officers to assign to it. The specific details of his post-war service are, in the fashion of a man whose life was largely lived in administrative records and ship's logs, rather than in the kind of personal correspondence that historians treasure, somewhat sparse. He appears. He is accounted for. He does his duty, and then, at some point in the 1750s, he disappears from the record in the way that men of his era and his station tend to disappear, not with a dramatic final entry, but with a simple cessation of appearances, after which the silence says everything that needs to be said. He died, as best historians can determine, sometime around 1751, though even this date carries an asterisk of uncertainty that the incomplete records of the period make unavoidable. He left behind no memoir, no extensive correspondence, no monument erected in his honor by a grateful maritime establishment. What he left behind was the world he had helped to make, which was a different and more ordered place than the world he had inherited, and which carried his influence forward in ways that did not require his name to be attached to them. The golden age of piracy, meanwhile, was dying. Not quickly, not cleanly. These things never end cleanly, but the trajectory that had been established at Ocracoke, the demonstration that authority could reach into the most protected pirate sanctuaries and extract a decisive outcome, continued to assert itself across the years that followed, compressing the space in which the Atlantic pirates could operate until that space became too small to sustain the life they had built within it. The Bahamas, that great open republic of piracy centered on New Providence, had already been substantially addressed before Ocracoke. Woodes Rogers, a former privateer of considerable ability and nerve, appointed Royal Governor of the Bahamas in 1718, had arrived at Nassau in July of that year with a naval force and a very clear mandate, and had proceeded to transform the pirate haven into something resembling a functioning colonial administration, with a speed and decisiveness that impressed observers across the Atlantic world. He brought pardons for those who would accept them and gallows for those who would not, and the combination proved effective. New Providence ceased to be a sanctuary. What Rogers accomplished in the Bahamas, Maynard accomplished at Ocracoke. What both accomplished together was a demonstration, replicated enough times and in enough places that it became impossible to ignore that the geography of the Atlantic was no longer reliably outside the reach of the law. The inlets and cays and shallow anchorages that had made the Golden Age possible were being catalogued, navigated, and contested by authorities who had finally decided that the cost of not contesting them was higher than the cost of the attempt. Bartholomew Roberts, the most prolific pirate of the entire Golden Age by almost any statistical measure, a Welsh captain who captured somewhere in the region of 400 vessels across a career of extraordinary range and audacity, fell in February of 1722, killed in an engagement with HMS Swallow off the coast of West Africa. His death, like Blackbeard's, sent a message. Unlike Blackbeard, Roberts had operated largely in the sense of invulnerability that the sheer scale of his success conferred, and his fall was in some ways even more shocking to the pirate community than Blackbeard's had been, because Roberts had been careful and clever and disciplined in ways that Blackbeard, for all his gifts, had not always been. By the mid-720s, the Golden Age was functionally over. It did not vanish entirely. Piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean would continue in various forms for decades, and the problem of piracy in other waters would persist far longer than that. But the specific phenomenon of the early 18th century, the period in which hundreds of experienced, organized men operated under black flags across thousands of miles of Atlantic with something approaching impunity, that phenomenon had run its course. The authorities had learned how to reach it. The sanctuaries had been contested. The most capable and most feared of the pirates had been killed or captured, or had accepted pardons and retired into the ordinary world that had once expelled them. The world that emerged from this process was not a perfect world. Colonial trade routes remained dangerous in various ways. The mechanisms of maritime law remained imperfect and unevenly applied. The Atlantic was not, and would not become for a long time, a genuinely safe and lawfully governed space in the way that the merchants and governors of 1718 might have hoped. But the specific threat that Blackbeard had represented, the threat of organized, charismatic, geographically protected piracy, operating with effective impunity in the American coastal waters. That threat had been addressed, and the addressing of it owed more to the morning at Ocracoke Inlet than to almost any other single event. There is a particular kind of historical influence that operates without attribution, that changes the shape of things so completely that subsequent generations inhabit the changed shape without awareness of what it replaced or what it cost to replace it. Robert Maynard's influence on the Atlantic world of the 18th century was largely of this kind. The merchant captains who sailed the Virginia and Carolina coast in the years after 1718, who made their runs between colonial ports and English harbors with an anxiety that was real but measurably less acute than the anxiety of their predecessors. Those men did not think of Maynard. They did not know his name in most cases. They simply sailed in a world that was incrementally safer than the world of 5 years earlier, and they could not have told you precisely why. He had given them that safety without asking to be remembered for it. What then do we make of Robert Maynard? What is the right way to understand a man who accomplished something genuinely consequential and then continued quietly and without complaint to do his duty for decades afterward, and who died leaving behind almost no personal record of what any of it had meant to him? There is a temptation when confronting this kind of figure to project, to supply the inner life that the historical record withholds, to imagine the veteran lieutenant in his later years sitting somewhere and reflecting on that November morning with a mixture of pride and rueful awareness of how completely the world had moved on from it. It is a tempting image. It is also almost certainly too tidy. Real lives, even the lives of people who have done remarkable things, do not tend to organize themselves around their most remarkable moments in the way that retrospective narrative suggests. Maynard had a career that lasted decades. He had colleagues and superiors and subordinates, and the ordinary texture of institutional life in a functioning navy. Ocracoke was part of that life. It was not, from the inside, necessarily the part that defined all the others. What we can say, with some confidence, is that the qualities Maynard demonstrated at Ocracoke were not qualities that appeared from nowhere in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1718 and then vanished once the fighting was done. They were qualities of character, steadiness, adaptability, the willingness to absorb the worst a situation could offer and continue functioning. That had been built over years of service before the battle, and that persisted in the service that came after it. He was, in the fullest sense, a professional, and professionalism of that caliber, in the conditions under which he exercised it, is not a lesser thing than heroism. It is, in its way, a rarer one. The sea does not build monuments. The water that covered Ocracoke Inlet on the morning of November 22nd, 1718, covered it again by the afternoon, indifferent to everything that had happened on its surface. The marsh grass grew back. The sandbars shifted, as sandbars do, reorganizing themselves without reference to the history that had been made among them. Today, Ocracoke Island is a quiet place, reachable only by ferry, inhabited by a small and deeply rooted community, visited by people who come for the beaches and the pace of it, and the sense of distance from the mainland. Some of them know what happened there, most simply feel, without knowing why, that the place carries a weight that the ordinary coastline does not. They are not wrong. There is a kind of greatness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with banners, or with broadsheets, or with the kind of dramatic personal mythology that makes a man's name travel easily across centuries. It arrives quietly, in the form of a decision made in the dark hours before dawn, or in the form of a course held steady when every reasonable instinct would have permitted retreat. It arrives in the form of a man who looked at an impossible morning and decided, with no particular fanfare, that it was simply the morning he had been given and that he intended to meet it properly. Robert Maynard was that kind of greatness. He did not write the story of what he did. He did not seek the audiences that would have allowed him to shape how it was remembered. He sailed back to Virginia with the proof of what had happened, hung grimly from his bowsprit, delivered his prisoners, wrote his reports, and returned to the business of being a naval officer in a navy that always had more work than it had officers willing to do it thoroughly. He left the legend, making to others. History, in its characteristic fashion, obliged him by largely doing exactly that. And yet here we are, 3 centuries removed from that grey November morning on the Carolina coast, still talking about what happened there. Still trying to understand the man who made it happen. Still finding, in the shape of his choices and the texture of his character, something that rewards the attention we bring to it. The legend of Blackbeard has never needed our help to survive. It burns on its own fuel, vivid and self-sustaining, and endlessly renewable in the imagination of anyone who encounters it. But the story of the man who ended Blackbeard requires something more from us. It requires us to look past the spectacle toward the substance, to ask not merely what happened, but who made it happen, and what kind of person that required. The answer, when we sit with it long enough, is both humbling and quietly exhilarating. It required an ordinary man, ordinary in the sense that he had no supernatural gifts, no destiny written in advance, no quality that could not be explained by the combination of training and temperament, and the particular moral seriousness that some people simply carry through their lives without making a great production of it. He was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy. He had 2 small sloops and 60 men, and imperfect charts of waters he did not know well. He had a mission that any rational assessment of the available forces would have described as extremely dangerous and entirely possible to fail. He did not fail, and in not failing, he did something that reverberated across the Atlantic world for years, in ways he could not have predicted and would likely not have claimed credit for. He demonstrated that the sea had limits, that even its most protected and most defiant corners were not beyond the reach of a patient, prepared, and genuinely courageous authority. He demonstrated that the man who has thought more carefully and held his nerve more completely will, in the end, tend to prevail over the man who has only his reputation and his ferocity to sustain him. He demonstrated, in the most concrete way available, that the law is not merely an idea. It is a practice, and it requires, to be made real in the world, people willing to go out and practice it in difficult places. Ocracoke Inlet is peaceful now. The water moves through it with the unhurried authority of water that has been moving through the same channel for millennia and will be moving through it long after every name associated with the morning of November 22nd, 1718. has faded from the last human memory that holds them. The inlet does not distinguish between the famous and the overlooked. It does not rank its mornings by the significance of what happened on them. But we can. We can look back at that morning and see it clearly. The 2 small sloops, the cold light, the man on the deck of the Jane who sent his crew below and waited, and held, and did not break. We can see what it cost, and what it changed, and what it meant. We can give it the weight it deserves. Robert Maynard hunted the legend. The least we can do is remember the hunter.